International travel and tourism collapsed as a result of Covid-19. So how important was that collapse on the economies of the countries that are most dependent on tourism? And how important is international travel as a predictor of the impact of the pandemic? Hello, Gian Maria.
Hello, Tim.
First of all, tell me, how big was the decline in tourism and international travel during 2020 and 2021?
It was awful for tourism-dependent economies. Revenues in 2020 were down two-thirds. We don't have figures yet for 2021. We know tourism arrivals were down even a little bit more than overall revenues, over 70% in 2020. I think 2021, very preliminary figures on arrivals, things are marginally better, but we are still talking about 70% below pre-COVID times. So still a very, very tough picture.
Yes, that's huge, isn't it? What type of countries are most affected by that decline in revenues for travel and tourism? And I suppose on the other side, which countries would have been spending the most on it?
So the most affected countries are typically small. They are small islands in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific that rely heavily on tourism. So think of, say, Jamaica, think of Cyprus or Malta in the Mediterranean, think of Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, think of Pacific Islands, New Caledonia, Vanuatu in the Pacific. So those have been really hammered. But you have also slightly larger economies that are hit severely. One example is Thailand. It's, I think, 600 billion economy, but super heavily reliant on tourism. In Europe, Portugal, Greece, but also Spain, Italy. So it's a hit that is not just on small countries. On the other side, those that send more tourists abroad are countries like China, Russia, Germany. But there is a big difference between those that receive and those that send. Namely, for those that receive tourism, tourism is extremely important as a share of GDP. For those that send tourism, sure, there is some spending abroad by domestic residents, but relative to the overall size of the economy, it is not a huge amount. So it's a concentrated hit on the receivers, and the impact is more diffuse, if you want, on those that send tourists abroad.
So for the receivers, the countries whose economies will be most effective, how deeply were their economies affected? How big was the decline in revenues for them?
In some cases, it was massive. I mean, we're talking about, over 10% of 10 percentage points of GDP, even more for small islands. You have to think that the impact on overall economic activity is a little bit lower than the overall impact of revenues. So it is true that say the spending by foreign tourists may be down, 20 percentage points of GDP, but as a share of that spending may have been on imported food, on imported energy for the air conditioning of the hotels, on hotel bills that in part go to profits of foreign-owned hotels. So the net hit to the economy is not really 20 percentage points of GDP, but it's still very large because you have workers there and you have, supply chains domestic that provide services to tourism. You have tour operators. So it's still a very, very large hit.
What about their current account balances? They suffer in the same way?
They suffered less than the overall hit for the reasons I mentioned. So, their oil bill went down, not just part was actually oil prices fell, and tourism dependent economies are typically oil importers. But also energy consumption fell just because hotels were closed. Say hotel profits went down, imports of food went down, and those cushioned a little bit the impact on the current account. But still, the impact on domestic demand, on economic activity, was very, very large. These countries had, declines in GDP easily exceeding 10% in 2021. In 2020, sorry.
Gian Maria, we instinctively think of the countries that are most affected by COVID-19 as being the ones with the highest numbers of cases, the highest numbers of deaths. Does this research paint us a slightly different picture on the economic impact?
Let me say that clearly the severity of the domestic pandemic and the severity of domestic lockdowns mattered for overall economic performance in 2020. There is no question. However, in terms of overall importance for countries that were dependent on tourism, the extent of tourism dependence was the single most important factor in shaping economic activity during the year. And the easiest way to think about it is consider an economy that is had very few cases, say a small island, the Caribbean, but they just got no tourism arrivals. The hit on GDP is massive, even though the domestic direct impact of the pandemic may be very limited. So again, all factors matter, but for tourism-dependent economies, the extent of dependence on tourism was the crucial variable.
These countries that are tourism dependent, of course it's terrible for them, but they are not the lowest income countries in the world. So even if tourism and international travel takes some time to pick up, how concerned should the international community be about the effect on their economies?
So I think the aggregate impact, I say, at the global level is still non-trivial, because there are economies that are of a larger scale. I mean, think of Spain, the fourth largest economy in the euro area, where GDP at the end of the third quarter was still 6-7% below the pre-COVID levels, while the rest of the euro area was basically had almost closed the gap. So there is a meaningful hit to economies that are of non-trivial size. But it is true that some of the smaller economies are typically middle income economies, but they are economies that started with low trend growth rates in general and very heavily indebted. So if you have to think in terms of international rescue plans, of needs for debt write-downs, a need for debt restructuring, those will be clearly there. And you have a number of these economies already in negotiations with creditors, and I'm sure there will be more in the pipeline. As I say, it is small GDP, but these are still, members of the international community, and certainly for my former colleagues at the IMF, there's a lot of work going on these countries and their debt sustainability problems.
Absolutely, and real people effective. It just goes to show that the decline in international travel isn't just about us not getting our holidays this year, isn't it? Gian Maria, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Tim.
The paper's a short one this week. It's called The Travel Shock, and the author is Gian Maria Milesi-Ferretti. You can download it using this link. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.